So good morning, everyone. I'm just letting people join and then we will kick off the webinar for today. Good morning and thank you for joining. We can see the numbers ticking up, so we're just letting the last few people join and then we'll kick off. Okay, so thank you for joining. I'm Fiona Dunsar. I'm the Government Actuary and I'm chairing this session today. The 2022 based national population projections were published by the ONS on the 28th of January this year. And so I'm really delighted that we're joined by James Roberts, who heads the Population and Household Projections Unit at ONS, to talk these through. I'll introduce James and the other speakers from GAD in just a few moments. The objective of today is to provide some more technical background on these new projections, how they've changed from previous projections and how we use them in our work at GAD. And in particular, a large proportion of our work is for the public sector pension schemes. So assumptions for future improvements in mortality are very important when considering the finances of these huge schemes that cover over 15 million people in the UK. But frankly, at GAD, we are pretty heavy users of the national population projections and use them in a huge range of different areas of our advice. So in the agenda today, we're going to give you some background detail on what the national population projections are and how they're produced. We'll then look at historic mortality improvements and how these feed into the assumptions underlying the projections. And we then have three actuaries from GAD who are going to provide you with a little more background on how we use the projections across these three areas of our work. We've got a wide range of attendees on the webinar today across the public and private sector, from clients and also advisors, and across the regions in the UK. So I hope there's going to be something for everyone here. You can put questions into the Q&A button on Teams, and we'll aim to cover as many of these as we can as we go at the Q&A session at the end. But as we go through, you can also upvote the questions that you think are most relevant and that you really want to hear about. We'll also be sharing a copy of the presentation, actually a recording, through YouTube at the end, and we'll send you a link to that. So let me introduce the speakers. We'll start with James Roberts from ONS, and he leads the team who produced the projections. Jenny Bullen leads GAD's central mortality team and is involved in ensuring that we're using appropriate mortality assumptions across our advice. And she also provides support to advice into ONS as well. And Laura, Joanne and Beth are actuaries at GAD, and they're going to be giving a flavour of how we use the projections across the various teams that you can see here. So with that, James, over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, so delighted to be joining you today to talk about the 2022 based national population projections. I'm going to talk to you first off about the key results from the projections, and then I'm going to run through the new assumptions that we set for each of the components of change, and also help you a bit with navigating the release should you want to find specific data sets or pieces of information from the release as well. Okay. So to start off with, I just want to talk to you in general terms about what the national population projections are. So first of all, it's important to mention that these aren't forecasts and they're not taking, not directly building in government policy or the potential direct impacts of policy, which we might see on demographic change. The national population projections are really important for a range of different policy development areas, national level planning, and they provide that common planning framework for a number of different areas, including fiscal projections, forecasts, and pension planning as well. We have a wide range of users both within and outside of government, and we're aware of the range of different users out there. So an important point to mention here at the outset is that as trends in births, deaths, and migration change, then our assumptions in future projections also change. So as I speak with you this morning and show you the assumptions, hopefully you'll see that where we've seen changes in all of these components, we've been adjusting our assumptions and updating these for use in the projections. The projections show you what the future population size and age structure might look like based upon the assumptions that we make. But at the same time, demographic behavior is inherently uncertain, and we know that there will continue to be evolution in fertility, migration, and mortality. And so, as I've already said, we revisit and update the assumptions over time and include those new assumptions in the projections. So these are two of the key pieces from the release of 28th of January. So providing you with a link here to the bulletin, and then also the accompanying national statistical blog, which sets out more of the context to the release and also provides you with a range of links to everything that we published on the 28th of January as well. So a couple of links there for you should you wish to look at those pieces and have not already seen them. So if I start at the overall level with some of the key results, over the first 10 years of the projections between mid-2022 and mid-2032, the population of the UK is projected to million or 7.3%. And so this is of a broadly comparable level compared with our previous 2021 based interim release. So we're seeing this move from an estimated 67.6 million to 72.5 million, and the increase is projected to arise from net migration of 4.9 million, and really a balance of births and deaths of 6.8 million over that 10-year period. So then if we move on and look at the longer time series and place this into the context of a 25-year period, we can see that over 25 years to mid-2047, total population growth for the UK is projected to be 8.9 million or 13.2%. And looking at the mid-year population estimates, which provides that time series of data up to the base year, we can see that in comparison, we saw between 1997 and 2022 an estimated increase of 9.3 million or 15.9%. Now, of course, there are variations across the UK, and once again, the projections suggest that we'll see population growth in England being faster than other parts of the UK. With a 14.5% increase projected for England, compared with 10.3% in Wales, 6.2% in Scotland, and then 1.1% for Northern Ireland. So if we move on to then consider some of the differences by age group, so mid-2022, there were 1.7 million people aged 85 years and over, making up about 2.5% of the population. Now, by mid-2047, this is projected to have nearly doubled to 3.3 million, or representing 4.3% of the total population. So there are projected to be many more people of older ages by mid-2047, and in part that's because of some of the cohorts that we see moving into those older ages, as well as increases in life expectancy same time, our fertility assumptions have moved down, as I will show you. And so by mid 2047, we see the implications of those lower fertility rates in the projections as well. As part of the release, in addition to the principal projection, we released a range of variant projections, and we know that users really like to use these. So these show what happens if you change one of the single components of change. So, for example, if fertility was higher or if mortality was lower. And then also we have combined variants where we change more than one component of change. So for example, the high population shows the combined impact of changing all of the components in some way. And so there's a specific article showing you all of these and enabling you to compare them as well. So it's well worth looking at the article that exists if you're using the variant projections. Just going to briefly talk to you about the development of the new assumptions. So a lot of activity goes into the development of the assumptions. We review the assumptions from the previous projections and look at what has been happening with the demographic trends since we last did that. We seek expert advice in each topic area and do that over a relatively long period in developing the assumptions. And that's very important for what we're doing, where we have topic-specific expert advisory panels. In this release, we've also included census 2021 and 2022 data, where that's also become available to us from Scotland. We have the back series of population estimates, which have been revised or updated following both of those censuses as well. We've used the cohort component projections method, and for each of these components of change, we've published detailed articles on the assumptions. So those exist, and you can look at those in a lot of detail and understand those. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about each of the assumptions. So the fertility assumptions we have moved down from the previous release. So the chart here is showing the 2016 through to the 2022 based assumptions for the principal assumption. And you can see that the long-term fertility, the long-term assumption for completed family size in the UK has been moved to 1.45 children per woman by mid 2047, and that's lower than the previous rounds of projections. We've also looked at the latest TFR data for 2023, and where again that had showed a marked decrease from 2022. And we look at these both in the first 5 years over the short term, and then also over the longer term. For international migration, we've increased our long-term assumption from 315,000 up to 340,000. And again, we've used a linear interpolation from the latest provisional figure to reach that long-term assumption. So we've included the latest migration figures from the release of November for the years to mid 2023 and mid 2024. And so those estimates are being used within the projections period to move the population on as in line with those migration estimates that we've published. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty in both the migration estimates, and then so we also do see that in the assumptions for the resulting projections for this component as well. So if I move on to the mortality assumptions, this is one of the more complex areas, and we project future age-specific mortality rates based upon past trends, and as an assumed annual percentage change in mortality rates by age and sex in the long run. And we've used a new age period and cohort model, which has been under development, quality assurance, and testing for a number of years. In 2023, we also completed user engagement, where we showed some of the results from this and allowed users to feedback to us and provide us with their views. And that's been very valuable in all of our assurance activities on including it in the projections. So the model separates the contribution of age period and cohort effects on that mortality improvement. And the long-term mortality improvement for both the principal and the variant were derived based upon analyses of the historical data and then also feedback from the mortality expert advisory panel, which has been very valuable to us in developing these assumptions. So the assumed long-term rate of annual mortality improvement in 2047 is 1.1% for ages 0 to 90, and then for ages 91 to 109, we have a lower long-term rate of annual mortality improvement, where these decline to zero mortality improvement in a linear way for age 110. Doing this yields these period life expectancies at birth at the UK level of in 2047 of 82.1 years for males and 85.7 years for females. And the chart here is showing you the historical data for the female period cohort, for female period life expectancy at birth, and then the change in that between the 2012 based and the 2022 based projections. The equivalent data for males can also be found in the assumptions article, and it's an important point to make here that the 2022 based principal projections of period life expectancy at birth 0.3 years lower for males and 0.1 years higher for females than in the assumption set before this release. So just to quickly introduce, we also published a UK Population Projections Explorer tool where users can adjust assumptions and see the impacts on this of alternative assumptions which they can set on the UK population. So a link to the tool is here and also from the blog. So do explore that if that's something that might be of interest to you. The release contents again included the table of contents, which is an incredibly helpful way of accessing both of the key table types. And then we've also published on NOMIS, and we have put out a report which compares the projections to the estimates as well. Thank you.
That's great. Many thanks, James, for giving that really helpful overview as to what the national population projections are derived and the information that is available. For the remainder of this session, we're going to talk a little bit about how we at GAD use this information. As Fiona mentioned, we are heavy users, and in particular, I am going to focus on the mortality aspects, giving a bit of context as to how these have changed over time. And I will start by sort of taking quite a long zoomed out approach, looking at the life expectancy changes at birth over the past 150 years. The male life expectancy is the sort of slightly purple line, and the female is slightly higher green line. But overall, we have seen historically very high rates of improvement from around 40 life expectancy at the start of the 20th century to nearly doubling by the end. This has been driven sort of by different areas of improvement. So initially in the first half, this was very much driven by improvements in sanitation, vaccinations, antibiotics that were improving the life expectancy, particularly for younger people. And in the second half, we had improvements, a lot of improvements around cardiovascular treatments. So the increased use of statins and the improvements there. So different reasons, but over that time frame, we have seen marked improvements in life expectancy. You might just about be able to see it at the end of that chart. It looks as though that nice steep line upwards is flattening out a bit. And we have noticed, so we're looking at a slightly different thing on this chart, that we're looking at what those improvements have been. So we've seen high levels of improvements throughout the 20th century, and that continued from 2000 to 2010. And you can see those improvements slightly higher for males in this period, but decreasing dramatically over the time from around 2011. And we have also had in this time frame the unusual experience of the COVID to consider. I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with these charts showing how many excess deaths unfortunately were experienced over that time frame. And this chart is just using ONS's methodology of how many more deaths were observed than might have been expected, really emphasising these two peaks in early 2020 and a slightly broader peak over 2021, stabling out a little bit from 2022 onwards. So whilst there are some periods of higher deaths, there are also some periods of lower, which is more in line with typical mortality volatility that's observed. So what do these past trends mean for ONS's models and how the projections are evolving? So we know that we've had this period of steadying life improvements. So the past trend has been that the improvements have been lower. We know what the shock is in terms of we know there's been unusual experience in 2020 and 2021 that we want to consider as unusual. So that's not something that we and ONS anticipate seeing coming through further in later years in the projection. So there needs to be a methodology of dealing with that. And in particular, ONS took advice from their expert panel, and it was agreed that actually the years 2020 and 2021 should be treated as shock years, and that shock should be removed over a period of 5 years from the base year 2022. So that is removing, unwinding that shock that is observed, that is unusual experience, but the data for 2020 and 2021 is still in the model. And the final bit of the puzzle is to look at what that sort of target rate in the longer term will be. So the ONS model has a target rate that is input for 2047, so 25 years into the future, and the rates will tend to that rate over the period of time. And again, following advice from the expert panel, that rate has decreased very slightly from the previously adopted assumption of 1.2% per annum down to the 1.1% in the 2022 population projections. So what does this mean in terms of the changes? So this is a similar chart to what James had previously, and just sort of digging into a little bit more detail. So you can see very clearly on here the solid lines are the males at the bottom of the chart, and we can see that over the period of the projections that life expectancy is decreasing. So I should be very careful that the expectation of life has gone down, but we are still anticipating, the model is still anticipating that life expectancy is increasing over that time. So ONS's assumptions are decreasing over the period from 2012, but still life expectancy over that time period is increasing. It's a similar trend for the dotted lines at the top of the chart. But a little bit more nuanced in the relationship between the 2020 and the 2022. So there is a bit of a crossover that can be seen, which equates to the slightly higher life expectancy from birth of 0.1 increase for females compared to the 0.3 years lower for males that James referenced earlier. So hopefully that's given a sort of very high level overview of the mortality assumptions and the rationale and an understanding of how those have been derived. I think it sort of emphasises how inherently uncertain the assumptions are, and why it's particularly useful to have the range of variants that ONS have produced this time. If I've flick on to show you what those variants are in respect of the mortality piece, we can see these variants assume, in respect of the mortality, assume the change impacts the long-term improvement only. So all the assumptions prior to the 47 are fundamentally unchanged, but they tend to a different long-term rate. In this chart, the principal projections are the pink line. The high life expectancy line is shown in green, and this is assuming a 1.5% long-term improvement rate. And the low life expectancy line is a 0.5% long-term rate, so not quite symmetrical, but these are sort of more plausible variants than may have been produced in the past. Probably should also add that they weren't produced for part of the 2020 populations because they were interim, and noting the complexity around lack of census data and COVID complications. But so yeah, it's really useful to be having those projections in these population projections. There is one further variant that isn't shown on there that has 0 improvements from 2047, so that's the no improvement variant. Hopefully that has given a helpful overview on the mortality side, and I will pass over to Laura to give you a bit more information on the NIF.
So thanks, Jenny and James. And just before Laura and other colleagues from GAD pick up the examples of how we're using that, just wanted to remind folks that you can put any questions into the Q&A tab and we'll pick them up at the end. We do have questions coming in, but just as a reminder. All right, thanks, Laura. Over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. So hi, I'm Laura. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work that GAD do in respect to the National Insurance Fund, and that uses the ONS population projections. So at GAD, there are 2 main jobs that we carry out in respect to the National Insurance Fund, or the NIF, as we like to call it. The first of those is the uprating report, and that's an exercise that we carry out every year. It projects the NIF over 5 years, and its main purpose is to show the impact of the annual benefit increases. So the triple lock increases on state pension being the main one of those. There is also the quinquennial review, and that takes place every 5 years, with the most recent of those having an effective date of 31st of March 2020. This looks over the NIF a much longer time period, so over 65 years, and is to look at the kind of longer term trends of the NIF and kind of how allow the government to make decisions in respect of kind of contribution rates or benefits. To be able to project the National Insurance Fund and its balance, we need to have an idea of what the population is looking like. And to do that, we use quite a lot of ONS's population projections. So in respect of mortality, fertility, and migration. We also need some information about employment figures, which there isn't a projection from ONS on, but we do use some of ONS's data to feed into that to show the distribution of earnings across the working age population. And this allows us to split the population into the working life population who are paying national insurance contributions into the fund, and then the pensioners that are receiving the benefits from it. I'm now just going to talk through a couple of examples of the results that we produce as a result of this work. So both of these charts are taken from the Quinquennial Review 2020. And the first of that is showing the kind of population projection over the 65 years from 2020. And this is split into children, working age population, and pensioners. And then the blue line across it is the dependency ratio, which is the number of pensioners per 100 working age people. As you can see from this chart, the pensioner numbers in red are increasing relative to the working age population shown in yellow, and therefore the dependency ratio is increasing over time, and there were more pensioners for each working age population person. And this on its own, we would expect to decrease the contributions coming into the NIF and increase the benefits coming out of it. My second example shows the impact of various variant projections that we carry out. The demographic section that is shown there uses the ONS variant population projections that Jenny and James both talked about. So at the time that the QR 2020 was taking place, we used the 2018 variants that were available at that time. And for that, we used the high-low fertility, life expectancy, migration population projections. There's also some other variants in there in terms of the financial assumptions that we use, which don't use the projections. This table shows the impact of these on the expected fund exhaustion date and also the break-even rate, which is the contribution rate that would be required over the total projection period so that contributions equaled benefits. These different variants allow government to see the kind of impact on the fund of the key assumptions and kind of which ones make a bigger or smaller impact, and therefore to feed into their decisions around the future of the fund and the benefits coming into it. And with that, I'm just going to pass over to Joanne.
Thanks, Laura. So hi, I'm Joanne Gauche. I'm an actuary in GAD's Public Service Pension Schemes team. And the ONS future mortality improvements are very important for the work that we do for the public service schemes. So the government actuary is the scheme actuary for all the unfunded public service schemes. So that's the schemes for the civil service, NHS, teachers, police, fire, armed forces, and judges. We also do some work for the local government schemes. Much of the work that we carry out for the public service schemes involves making very long-term projections of contribution income and benefit expenditure, such as the valuations of the schemes that we carry out every 4 years, annual accounts, and determining actuarial factors, such as when a member wishes to take early retirement benefits. Mortality assumptions are an important part of these projections, as the mortality assumptions inform how long we expect benefits to remain in payment. As noted by Jenny, there are two elements to the mortality assumptions we adopt for the public service schemes. There are base mortality assumptions, and then there are assumptions about future mortality improvements. Historically, differences have been observed in mortality experience for those who are members of an occupational pension scheme relative to the population as a whole. Those who are members of an occupational scheme have tended to experience lighter mortality, that is, greater life expectancy than the general population. Therefore, we adopt scheme-specific base mortality assumptions for the public service schemes. The actuarial profession's continuous mortality investigation, the CMI, carry out analysis of UK-wide pension scheme data and develop a range of mortality base tables that actuaries can use in their work. The CMI produces separate base tables for groups that may have differential mortality experience. For example, they produce tables by gender, health status, and income levels. These are known as the CMI SAPS base tables. The public service pension schemes are sufficiently large that it's possible to undertake credible analysis of scheme-specific mortality experience. Therefore, we typically compare the scheme's experience with the CMI base tables, carry out a range of statistical tests to determine the best fit mortality table to adopt. And we also consider the assumptions adopted for the previous valuation and how the recent experience compares to these assumptions to inform how much weight we place on the recent experience. This chart illustrates a comparison of experience and assumptions for male normal health pensioners. The black line shows the mortality assumptions adopted in the 2016 valuation. The orange line shows the scheme's mortality experience between 2016 and 2020. And the dashed green line shows the assumptions proposed for the 2020 valuation. So this chart shows that there's some volatility in the experience, even for a very large scheme, and the shape of the CMI base table adopted for the 2016 valuation is slightly different to that adopted for the 2020 valuation. So whilst we adopt scheme-specific base mortality assumptions, the assumptions about how mortality rates might improve in the future are not determined on a scheme-specific basis. For the public service valuations, some of the underlying assumptions are set by Treasury to be common across all of the public service schemes. The mortality improvements are one of these directed assumptions. For the 2020 valuation, HMT directed that the ONS 2020 future mortality improvements should be used for the valuations of all the unfunded schemes. There wasn't anything to indicate that improvements in mortality for public service staff would be any different for those in the general population. So what impact or effect do these assumptions have on public service schemes? We can think about this in terms of a scheme valuation. We carry out valuations every 4 years. These valuations determine the liabilities of the scheme and in turn the required employer contribution rate. We can consider how a change in the mortality assumptions adopted affects the employer contribution rate required. So in this example, the chart shows how the required contribution rate changed from 22.8% at the 2016 valuation to 28.5% at the 2020 valuation. While the chart shows that the change in the financial assumptions contributed most to the change in the required employer contribution rate, the change in the mortality assumptions are also important. This change of 3% reflects the change in both the base table mortality assumptions and the changes in the mortality improvements, but most of the change relates to the future mortality improvements. As was mentioned earlier, future improvements in life expectancy reduced under ONS 2020 compared to ONS 2016. As part of the valuations, we also consider how sensitive the valuation results are to adopting different assumptions. For example, adopting mortality rates that are 5% higher could reduce the required employer contribution rate by about 1 percentage point. We're currently working on the 2024 evaluations of the public service schemes, and we'll be analysing the experience between 2020 and 2024 to help inform the base mortality assumptions. In due course, HMT will also determine the future mortality improvement assumptions to be adopted for these valuations. I'll now pass you on to Beth to talk about the mortality assumptions we use for the funded pension schemes.
Thanks, Joanne. So yeah, in this section, I'm going to talk about how GAD sets its mortality assumptions for funded pension scheme work. So for anyone who's not familiar, at GAD, we also advise on what are called funded pension schemes within the wider public sector. And these schemes differ from the public sector schemes Joanne was just talking about in that contributions are paid in and invested to accumulate more funds to cover the pension payments. But the work we do for these schemes, such as evaluations, factors and accounts, is broadly similar. For these schemes, the base mortality assumption is set in a very similar way to the public sector schemes, as Joanne just talked about, although we may not necessarily have enough experience in all of these schemes to do something bespoke. However, for mortality improvement assumptions, there's no requirement for the same assumption to be used across all schemes. Therefore, actuaries will need to use their judgment to set the assumption considering the purpose of the work and with regard to regulatory guidance. Not all of our schemes are strictly subject to this guidance, but many choose to follow it for best practice anyway. And this guidance for funding valuations says, firstly, that assumptions should be based on prudent principles, allowing for the uncertain nature of future mortality improvements. And secondly, consideration should be given to factors including socioeconomic factors specific to the scheme, and this should be reflected in the assumptions chosen. In many cases, the ONS mortality improvement assumptions that we've been discussing today is what's used as the mortality improvement assumptions. But in the light of discussing something different, I also wanted to comment on an alternative that's sometimes used. And we heard from Joanne earlier about how the CMI produced base tables that are used for base mortality assumptions. The CMI also produces a model called the CMI model for mortality improvement assumptions. This model is more commonly used in the private sector, and therefore in our work sometimes where there's a particular reason, such as if a scheme's considering a buyout, we might consider it more appropriate to use the CMI model. This model is updated on an annual basis, and the model is highly parameterized. The user must specify the long-term rate of mortality improvement that we talked about being set by an expert panel for ONS earlier. And there's also the option for the user to specify factors such as how much weight to place on recent experience, an initial adjustment to improvements, or to change the way that the COVID-19 experience is allowed for. Looking at this final slide, it shows a comparison to the most recently published ONS projections, ONS 2022, as we've been hearing about, and CMI 2023. There's a new version of the CMI model, CMI 2024, that's currently being consulted on. So these two graphs show a comparison of the life expectancy at age 65 for males and females between the two models. You can see that for males, the purple line, so ONS 2022, produces higher life expectancies currently, but by the 2060s, the CMI projection is expected to produce higher life expectancies. That's what you'd expect, given that for these examples, we've chosen an illustrative long-term rate of improvement assumption of 1.5%, so higher than what's used for ONS 2022. The pattern is similar on the right-hand side for females, but with a smaller initial difference between ONS and CMI. So hopefully that's a very brief overview of an alternative that's sometimes used, but as I said at the beginning, ONS 2022 is also used in our work. And that brings us to the end of our summary on how GAD thinks about mortality improvement assumptions in our work. So Fiona, I will hand back to you for the Q&A section.
So thank you very much to all our speakers, and I hope that through the examples given there, the financial materiality of the different mortality and demographic assumptions is really brought to life. And clearly demographic change is one of the key societal challenges and opportunities, but good data and analysis is fundamental to supporting good policy making and government activity on this. So the relevance here is, I think, probably clear to everyone. Thank you to you all for some of the questions that have come in, and feel free to put others in. I'm going to go through these in the last sort of 10 minutes or so that we have. And I'll flag to our various speakers who's likely to get it. So probably first up, James, this is coming to you in terms of a question. I'll read it out. So this may just be a question of different time horizons, but if fertility rate is much less than 2 and therefore lower than the replacement rate, then how come births and deaths are roughly equal in the projections? Okay,
perhaps I can just describe the trends here for those who are not already aware. So in the latest mid-year estimates, up to mid-2023, we saw about 16,000 more deaths than births at the UK level. So then in the early part of the projections period, it's projected that there will be more births than deaths to about 2028, 2029. From 2029 onwards, there are projected to be more deaths than births. So just to sort of like explain the sort of expected sort of future trends there. I think one of the things here, I think it's a really good question. I think it's complex looking at both the rates and the numbers here, because we're seeing a number of different things going on. We've got some relatively large cohorts who are reaching these older ages, and I think that's really important then in terms of the expectations with the number of deaths that we've got projected. With regard to fertility, we have, as I've said, we've moved the assumption down, and so that's leading to the projected number of births. I think Yeah, I mean, these things have really moved so close to each other, that I think it's more helpful to look at the numbers rather than to think about some of the sort of rates here directly, I want to say. I hope that's of some help.
Thanks, James. Jenny, I'll bring the next one to you, which is, I think, really one around healthy life expectancy. So the question is, if we expect people to live slightly longer lives going forward, can we say anything about the health-related quality of life that we expect those years to be lived in? And it may be that James wants to comment on that as well. But Jenny, why don't you have a go?
Thank you. So there are statistics around healthy life expectancy. Obviously, healthy life expectancy is slightly more difficult to define in a absolute term. It's obviously clear how long people live for, but life expectancy itself in terms of health is sort of self-reported measure. So there have been various statistics that ONS produce around what proportion of your life is likely to be spent in good health and how much isn't. I might sort of pass over to James to sort of talk about the ONS statistics around that a little bit more. But yes, I think it is obviously clearly a question that if life expectancy is increasing and the healthy life expectancy part isn't keeping up at the same rate, then there are potentially more pressures in health service and lack of quality of life for the individuals.
Yeah, so that's correct, Jenny. So we do publish statistics on healthy life expectancy. I think our most recent release was back in December, if I'm correct. So I think we've recently seen some falls for both England and Wales. To give an idea about the sort of 2021 to 2023 phase, so for those aged 65 years, the expectation for years in good health was about sort of 10.1 for males and sort of 11.2 for females, just to give some numbers there. It's an area where the office has also looked at doing health projections as well. I don't think we currently have work in progress on that, but it's worth exploring what exists in that regard if that's of particular interest to you, because I understand that there is also work on that exists out there. Okay.
And James, I think the data source is slightly different as well in that it is self-reported, albeit it's still, we're talking like a significant period of time that people are reporting as not being in healthy longer life, and the regional variation is also extremely wide as well, I think.
I believe so on both of those. Yes, I'm not really close to that work area, but I believe you're correct on both of those, though, Fiona.
I think I know there's some great maps on the ONS site for those that are. It's nothing I like more than a combination of demographics and maps, actually, albeit that I appreciate the underlying seriousness of the issues for folks as well. So this again might be one for you, James, which is, can you explain the reasoning for the long-term rate of mortality improvement falling from 1.2 to 1.1? So just the discussions that took place there in terms of that target rate.
Yes, and we'd had the previous improvement rate was 1.2%, and it had been at 1.2% for a very long time. Now, so for the last 10 years, we've seen mortality improvements have been consistently slower, and these have averaged around 0.8% per year for those aged between 20 and 79. This is at the UK level, sort of during the 2010s. So the long-term improvement rate of the 1.1% now, think about that as being an average. So that's in line with what was discussed and proposed by members of our expert advisory panel. And so we've used that for those aged 20 to 89. I think I would say, though, that there's considerable uncertainty about prospects for improvement rates in the long term. And the expert panel also noted that these might remain slow at certain ages, or that improvements might increase again and be a bit higher. So, for example, through better access to medical advancements, changes to health and social care policy, there could be those types of impacts that where there could be the potential for a higher improvement rate. But this was something that we discussed with the expert advisory panel at length, and we really valued all of their feedback on before moving down to that 1.1%.
Great. I suspect I'm going to be coming back to you on some of that later in a moment as well, but I'll give you a pause for a few moments. Jenny, here's one that I think will come to you. So the questions around for the GAD mortality rates that were explained in your second presentation, are they different from the ONS mortality assumptions? And if so, how or why? So maybe you can just clarify that point. And feel free to talk about where GAD is using different assumptions as well.
Yeah, so in terms of mortality improvements in the public sector schemes, as Joanne said, we typically are using the ONS population projections. We've clearly got very large schemes and a lot of overlap with the experience of the population. So I think all of the charts should have been referring to the sort of population projection improvements and looking at different timeframes. It's probably also important to note that there are different trends at different ages. So we're more concerned, I guess, in terms of the financial significance by changes around the older age population, and particularly recently there have been different trends. Younger mortality rates haven't been improving as much as older rates in the shorter term. So there are sort of various differences at what time periods and what ages that you look at. But no, I think hopefully everything in the charts was ONS improvements and just different sort of cuts of that data and just different ways of describing it.
Thanks. So, James, I suspect this is possibly a question that comes to what's the difference between a projection and a forecast or other modelling. And I'm not going to read it all out, but there's a great question from Peter around how social developments related to health and issues in the last decade or so being incorporated, given the sort of many uncertainties that there are that can influence the mortality rate. So changes in lifestyles, changes in medical interventions. We've been talking a lot, I think, about the impact of potentially the obesity drugs and what those might do in terms of health improvements, and but then against that, the challenges in terms of access to NHS and waiting lists, and the pressures from an aging population on that. So how are all of these things that we know are the sort of the consequences and the sort of background trends taken into account in forming the projections?
This is a real mixture of points here, I think. Fiona, as you're saying, I think it covers both the way in which these are projections and not forecasts. The discussion we've already been having about sort of healthy life expectancy, I feel, is also sort of involved in this. I would probably point to the discussions that we have with our expert advisory panel, and the range of topics that we cover with them. So we do that both through a questionnaire which we issue, where we ask for the sort of range of views over both the short term and the long term on what may happen with mortality. And then we also think through with the panel about the range of different of sort of health and mortality related topics and issues which could shape the future trends in mortality. So it's very hard for me to pick up a number of the themes in here and say that we have been able to cover all of these in a lot of detail, but we really, I know I've pointed to this several times this morning already, we really benefit from the discussions with the expert advisory panel about many of these factors and changes which are happening in the population, and what may happen for mortality as a result of these. So I appreciate that's a very general answer given the many points which are being covered here. I would also point out that we revisit the assumptions, as I was saying, and we consider the changes which we've seen between the projections and the estimates data which becomes available to us. So I think I can probably only point to those pieces and say that we consider as much as we can in terms of the scope of factors here.
Just before I let you have a rest for a moment, tell me exactly what do you mean, or for our audience, of it, their projections, not forecasts?
So, for example, if there was a stated sort of, so if there's a stated government policy to achieve a particular demographic outcome, the project is not the purpose of the projections to show what the implication of that might be. We look at the trends in demography, and we use those trends in developing these plausible assumptions about the future. So in this sense, we're guided by the data that we've been seeing on each of these demographic trends, rather than seeking to show what the implications of a particular policy direction might be.
Which is one of the reasons that we do get those experience changes from one set to another. If policy is effective on increasing the number of NHS and doctor appointments, one would expect to see some improvements, for example, but that's not being embedded into the analysis.
No. And there can also be uncertainties around the specific time period over which policy could be effective, couldn't there, for example? So so whilst there might be a statement about a policy achieving something, we don't necessarily know about what will transpire. There's uncertainty in this domain, isn't there?
And indeed, in some respects, that's when GAD and others are using the projections. We are at times then also using them to help to underpin some of other pieces of advice or analysis, which may have different variants and assumptions on them. I'm going to flip to Joanne and possibly Beth with just a quick question around how the directions and the factors that HMT consider in determining the mortality improvement assumptions for the public sector valuations. So what's the sort of range of information that's being considered there? Are they considering other models like the CMI for funded pension schemes? So Joanne, maybe you could just give a brief comment on that. We've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, in terms of the public service pension schemes, I'm in the team at GAD that advises the public service schemes. There is a separate team at GAD that advises Treasury, and we have to be quite careful that we keep them separated appropriately. So I don't know very much about what Treasury take into account in setting their assumptions, but my expectation is they will certainly look at other models and other factors. My understanding is that the ONS version, the ONS assumptions were adopted for the most recent valuations because there was nothing to indicate that public service staff were experiencing differences in improvements compared to the general population. And obviously these are really big schemes. They have people that are working across the country. They reflect lots of different socioeconomic groups. And so the general population is quite a good fit for the public service in terms of future improvements in mortality.
Great, thanks. Beth, is there anything you want to add on that?
Only that I think when setting the assumptions, there's sort of a range of objectives and aiming to meet of which, if the ONS would be considered, as well as I imagine the CMI, but nothing particular to add.
Great. Okay, one quick last one before we close. James, when's the next national population projections? When are the next ones going to be published?
So we don't currently have.
Is it painting the Forth Road Bridge here?
Well, it's always a consideration around the data that we build in and the expert advice and everything that we can include. At the moment, we're working with our users to open up a discussion with them on on when that should be. We don't have a date in the release calendar, but we will update that with a provisional date as soon as we're able to.
Okay, well, great. In the meantime, I know there's fantastic materials on the ONS site, and the various tools and variant projections and modeling that users can have is richer on every set of projections, I think. So I commend it to all of you who are on today. And with that, I would like to bring our webinar to a close. Thank our speakers, and particularly James from ONS in terms of his time and the insights he's given today. And thank all of you for attending and your questions. As I say, we'll follow up with a link and there will be ability to access the materials through the YouTube site. So thank you all. Bye-bye.